If that shrew gets a share, I swear I will walk out of this room and never look back. Jason Whitmore's voice cut through the silence of the law office like a blade that had no intention of being hidden again, and for a moment no one moved. Not even the lawyer Daniel Brooks, who had seen every kind of family conflict unfold across his polished mahogany table. Because something about the way Jason said it made it sound less like anger and more like a declaration of war inside a room where war was never supposed to happen. I stood near the end of the table. Eleanor Whitmore, 68 years old, dressed in a simple dark coat that I had chosen that morning, thinking this day would be about closure, not confrontation, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me as if I had already been sentenced without a word being spoken. Brittany Hale, my daughter-in-law, was the first to break the silence with a small, almost satisfied breath, her fingers lightly touching Jason's arm as if to steady him or encourage him, depending on how you interpreted the gesture. But I had learned long ago that nothing Brittany did was ever without intention. The room itself felt too clean, too controlled, the kind of place where people believed manners could hide cruelty, yet what had just been said could not be hidden by anything. Daniel Brooks adjusted the papers in front of him with deliberate calm, clearing his throat once before speaking in a tone designed to restore order, but order had already left the room. "We will proceed according to the instructions of the late Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, and those words alone seemed to tighten something in Jason's posture, as if the mention of his father was both a shield and a trigger. I remember noticing how Jason would not look at me directly, how his gaze kept sliding past me like I was an inconvenience rather than the woman who had raised him, and I wondered when exactly that shift had happened, not in one moment, but in a series of quiet decisions I had not been invited to witness. The lawyer continued speaking, but my attention drifted briefly to the long window beside us where the afternoon light fell across the city in pale, indifferent stripes, and I thought about how ordinary everything had looked just an hour earlier when I arrived, believing this would be a simple reading of a will, a formality, something my husband had arranged to bring structure after his passing. Instead, it already felt like I had walked into a room where the outcome had been decided long before I took my seat. Jason shifted again, restless now, his chair scraping softly against the floor as he leaned forward and spoke under his breath to Brittany. But the words were not meant to be hidden, not really, because they carried the weight of performance, of making sure everyone understood exactly where he stood. I did not respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because something inside me had already chosen silence, the kind of silence that does not surrender but observes, records, and waits. Daniel Brooks finally opened the sealed document, and the faint sound of paper unfolding seemed louder than anything Jason had said so far. And as he began to read the first lines of my husband's final instructions, I felt a strange stillness settle over me, the kind that comes when you realize the story is no longer beginning, but already halfway through its ending, and everyone in the room is about to find out what they have really been standing on. I stayed perfectly still as the lawyer continued reading, each word of the document landing with a strange kind of weight that did not belong to the paper itself, but to everything my husband had built and left behind. And yet what unsettled me most was not what was being said, but how Jason reacted to every sentence, as if he were listening for permission to become someone else in real time. The room remained quiet, but it was not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind that forces people to listen to their own breathing, their own assumptions, their own expectations about what comes next. Daniel Brooks spoke in a steady, professional tone, explaining allocations, references, and conditions that had clearly been prepared with great care, and I could sense Brittany leaning slightly forward beside Jason, her posture controlled but her attention sharp, as if she was calculating each phrase for meaning beyond what was written. Jason shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand briefly pressing against the edge of the table before pulling back as though even the surface beneath him had become unfamiliar, and I realized then that his confidence was not rooted in certainty, but in expectation that everything would naturally align with what he believed he was entitled to. The lawyer paused once, glancing at the document before continuing, and in that pause I found myself remembering something so ordinary it almost felt out of place in a moment like this. A Sunday morning years ago when my husband had insisted on reviewing his affairs not with urgency, but with calm certainty, as if he were arranging furniture rather than deciding the future of people. Jason had been there that day too, younger in voice but already impatient in tone, asking questions not about meaning but about outcome. And I had thought at the time that it was just ambition, something that would soften with maturity, but now I understood that ambition, when left unchecked, simply learns new ways to speak. The lawyer continued reading a clause that required patience and restraint from all beneficiaries in order for the distribution to remain valid, and I saw Brittany glance quickly at Jason, her expression tightening for just a second before she masked it again with composure. But Jason did not notice, or perhaps he chose not to notice, because he was already leaning too far forward in his own narrative to step back into reality. I felt the smallest shift inside the room, not loud enough for anyone to comment on, but enough to change the temperature of every expression present, as if the air itself had become more cautious. When Daniel Brooks moved to the next section, his voice lowered slightly, emphasizing conditions tied not only to inheritance, but to conduct, and I noticed Jason's jaw tighten as if he had just heard something personally directed at him, even though the words were still general. Brittany adjusted her posture again, this time slower, her hand resting briefly on the table before pulling away, and I realized she was not reacting to the document, but to Jason's reaction to it, which told me more than anything the lawyer was reading. I kept my hands folded in my lap, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that speaking would not change the direction this moment was taking, only reveal more clearly where everyone believed they stood. The lawyer turned another page, and the soft sound of paper seemed to echo louder than the voice itself, and I thought about how often families assume that silence means agreement when in truth, it often means observation. Jason finally leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if trying to regain control of something slipping away, and for the first time I saw uncertainty break through the surface of his confidence, not enough to stop him, but enough to show that something he had counted on was no longer guaranteed. And in that fragile space between expectation and reality, I began to understand that this reading was not just about what had been left behind. It was about what each of us believed we were entitled to, and how quickly that belief could begin to unravel when confronted with a version of truth none of us had prepared for. I did not realize at first how much the atmosphere in the room had changed until I noticed that Jason was no longer simply reacting to the words being read. He was now reacting to what he believed those words meant for him personally, as if every sentence was a challenge directed at his authority rather than a legal instruction regarding an estate, and that subtle shift made the silence feel heavier than before. Daniel Brooks continued in his calm, professional tone, moving through sections of the document that referenced financial structures, property distributions, and long-established accounts, each detail carefully outlined with the precision of someone who understood exactly how fragile family expectations can become when written down in legal language. I remained seated, my posture unchanged, but my awareness sharpened, not because I was trying to anticipate what would happen next, but because I was finally seeing how everyone else in the room revealed themselves when they believed they were about to gain or lose something important. Brittany leaned slightly closer to Jason again, her voice barely audible when she whispered something into his ear, and I saw his expression tighten in response, not with confusion but with frustration, as though she had confirmed a fear he had already begun to form on his own. The lawyer paused briefly to clarify a condition tied to the continuation of certain provisions, and in that pause Jason suddenly laughed once, a short sound that carried no humor, only disbelief, and he shook his head as if refusing to accept the structure of what was being explained. That moment was the first time he spoke without being prompted, interrupting the process with a sharp question about fairness, his tone rising just enough to break the controlled environment of the office, and immediately the room responded with subtle discomfort, several family members shifting in their seats without speaking. I watched him carefully, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that comes when emotional distance finally allows truth to become visible, because what I saw was not just frustration, but a deeply rooted assumption that everything in this room was meant to confirm his expectations. Daniel Brooks raised a hand slightly, not in confrontation but in professional correction, reminding everyone that the instructions were not open to interpretation, only execution, and that statement alone seemed to remove something from Jason's confidence, leaving it exposed. Brittany's expression changed almost imperceptibly at that moment, her eyes moving from the lawyer to Jason, then briefly toward me, and I recognized in her hesitation the beginning of calculation, the kind that appears when control over a situation starts to shift away from the person who has been guiding it. I did not move, I did not speak, but I observed every detail, the way Jason's fingers tapped once against the table, the way his breathing became slightly uneven, the way his certainty began to fracture into small, visible pieces that he tried unsuccessfully to hold together with volume and tone. The lawyer continued reading another section that referenced accountability and prior behavior in relation to the estate's conditions, and I saw Jason go still for the first time, not in defiance, but in recognition that something in the document was no longer abstract. Brittany stopped whispering at that point, her attention fully forward now, her posture rigid in a way that suggested she understood the direction this was moving even if she did not yet know the outcome. I felt the room narrowing around all of us, not physically but emotionally, as if every person had begun to realize that this moment was not about interpretation or negotiation, but about exposure. And in that growing tension, I understood something very clearly, that the most dangerous moments in a family are not the ones where voices rise, but the ones where silence begins to reveal what people have been assuming all along. I could feel the moment shifting even before Daniel Brooks reached the next page, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because Jason had stopped listening like a man trying to understand and had started listening like a man preparing to resist, and that difference was written all over his posture as he leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The lawyer's voice remained steady, but the content of what he was reading began to move away from simple distribution and into something more conditional, more structured, as if every line had been designed not only to divide an estate, but to measure character over time. I noticed Brittany's attention sharpen again, her eyes moving quickly between the lawyer and Jason, and for the first time, she was not performing calm confidence, but actively tracking outcomes, as though she had begun to understand that the situation was no longer as controllable as she had assumed. Jason broke the silence again, this time more controlled but still edged with irritation, asking for clarification about why certain provisions required what the lawyer called behavioral alignment, and Daniel Brooks responded without emotion, explaining that the late Mr. Whitmore had specified conditions tied to respect, communication, and public conduct within family proceedings. The word respect seemed to hang in the air longer than the others, and I saw Jason's jaw tighten as if he was personally offended by the concept rather than the condition itself. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember something I had not thought about in years, a dinner table conversation where my husband had spoken calmly about legacy not as money or property, but as the way people treat each other when they believe there are no consequences, and at the time I had thought he was simply being philosophical, not predictive. Now, sitting in this room, I began to understand that nothing about his decisions had ever been abstract. The lawyer continued, explaining that certain actions or statements made during formal proceedings could be considered relevant to eligibility, and Jason let out a short breath, leaning forward again as if he could physically push back against the structure of the document itself. Brittany placed her hand briefly on his forearm, a gesture that looked supportive on the surface but carried a tension underneath it, as if she was trying to stabilize him without fully agreeing with where he was headed. I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, but my attention had narrowed completely to the space between words, to the pauses where meaning often hides. Jason suddenly spoke again, louder this time, questioning whether a single reading of a document could truly reflect intent, and Daniel Brooks finally looked up from the page, meeting his gaze directly as he replied that intent had been documented repeatedly over time, not just in writing but in witness and procedure. That answer did not satisfy Jason, and I could see him begin to lose patience, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that suggested he had always believed disagreement would eventually force the system to adjust in his favor. Brittany, however, said nothing, and that silence from her was more revealing than anything she had said earlier, because it showed she was beginning to separate herself mentally from the certainty Jason was still clinging to. The lawyer turned another page, and the sound felt deliberate now, almost final in its rhythm, and I realized that everyone in the room was beginning to anticipate not just what would be read next, but what it would mean for them personally. Jason exhaled again, this time slower, his eyes fixed on the table rather than the document. And I saw for the first time a crack in his confidence that was not anger but doubt. It was small, almost invisible, but it changed the energy of the room in a way that could not be reversed. And in that quiet shift, I understood that the reading was no longer just about inheritance or procedure. It had become something far more revealing, a mirror none of us had been prepared to look into, where expectation and reality were finally beginning to separate themselves without permission. I could feel the room tightening again as Daniel Brooks reached a section of the document that no longer sounded like distribution and instead sounded like instruction, as if my husband had shifted from deciding who received what to deciding who deserved anything at all, and the change in tone was so subtle that only people paying close attention would notice the difference. Jason noticed it immediately. His posture changed first, shoulders lifting slightly as he leaned forward again, eyes narrowing as the lawyer read aloud conditions that tied portions of the estate to what Daniel called sustained family conduct and demonstrated respect toward all named beneficiaries. And for the first time, Jason interrupted not with anger, but with disbelief, asking the lawyer to repeat what he had just said, as if repetition might soften meaning. Daniel Brooks did not soften anything. He simply continued, explaining that certain allocations were not automatic but conditional, and that prior documented behavior during the proceedings could affect final distribution. I saw Brittany go still beside Jason, her fingers no longer moving, her attention fixed entirely on the lawyer now, not Jason, not me, but the structure of the situation itself, as if she was suddenly recalculating something she had assumed was already secured. Jason's voice rose slightly as he asked whether this was even legal, and Daniel responded calmly that everything had been prepared and witnessed according to state law, with multiple legal confirmations over time, and that nothing being read now was unexpected to those who had respected the process. That word again, respected, landed differently this time. Jason's face tightened in a way that suggested he was hearing something personal inside a legal explanation, as if the document itself had begun to reflect not just instructions but judgment. I remained silent, but inside me something shifted, not shock, not anger, but recognition, because I began to see the pattern forming beneath every clause, a pattern I had not been invited to understand while my husband was still alive. There had always been conversations I was present for, but not truly included in. Discussions where my husband would pause at certain words and look at people differently, depending on how they reacted, and I now realized those moments were not casual at all. Daniel Brooks turned another page, and the sound of paper felt heavier than before, as if the document itself had gained weight through what it was revealing. Jason leaned back again, but this time it was not confidence returning, it was something closer to discomfort, as if the room had begun to feel smaller around him. Brittany finally spoke softly, asking a question about interpretation, but her tone lacked the earlier certainty, and I could hear hesitation in the way she chose her words, carefully avoiding anything that might bind her too closely to Jason's reaction. The lawyer responded that interpretation was not required, only acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement was already recorded in the formal proceedings. Jason let out a short laugh again, but it did not carry disbelief this time. It carried strain, like someone trying to maintain control over a situation that was no longer responding to them. I watched him closely now, not because I was afraid of what he might do, but because I was finally seeing him clearly, not as my son in memory, but as a man confronting limits he had never considered real. The room felt different now, less like a legal reading and more like a slow unfolding of consequences that had been prepared long before any of us arrived. Daniel Brooks continued, his voice steady, describing how continued eligibility required adherence not only to financial clauses but to behavioral standards during formal family proceedings. And Jason's expression changed again, this time more controlled, more cautious, as if he was beginning to understand that speaking further might not improve his position. Brittany lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up, and I could see it now, the first real fracture between expectation and outcome forming quietly in her expression. I did not move, but I felt something inside me settle into place, a quiet understanding that what was being revealed was not just about inheritance, but about perception, about how each of us had been seen long before we ever entered this room. And in that realization, I understood that the reading had stopped being about what was written on paper and had become something far more final, a reflection none of us could interrupt, no matter how loudly we spoke or how carefully we calculated what came next. I began to notice a shift in the room that had nothing to do with what Daniel Brooks was reading and everything to do with how Jason was beginning to interpret it, because the certainty that had once supported his posture was now being replaced by something far less stable, something that looked like calculation under pressure. The lawyer's voice remained steady, continuing through clauses that connected eligibility not only to inheritance structure, but also to conduct during formal proceedings, and each sentence seemed to remove another assumption Jason had been holding without ever questioning it. I watched him closely as he leaned forward again, but this time it was not aggressive. It was focused, almost tense, as if he was trying to find a mistake in the logic rather than challenge the authority behind it. Brittany remained quiet now, her earlier confidence fully gone, replaced by a careful stillness that suggested she was no longer trying to guide Jason's reaction, but simply trying to survive it without being pulled into it. Daniel Brooks turned another page and began reading what sounded like a clarification section, explaining that the late Mr. Whitmore had explicitly documented expectations regarding communication, respect, and acknowledgement among beneficiaries, and that deviation from those expectations had been noted during prior family discussions. Jason immediately reacted to that, his voice lower now, but sharper, asking what exactly had been recorded and by whom. And for the first time, Daniel paused before answering, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision, as if choosing the exact wording mattered more than speed. He explained that multiple formal meetings had included witness presence, and that behavioral responses during those meetings had been part of the documented record. I felt something inside me tighten at that, not fear, but recognition, because I now understood that what my husband had been building was not just a legal structure, but a memory of behavior, a record of how people acted when they thought consequences were not immediate. Jason sat back slightly, his arms no longer crossed as tightly, his fingers now resting on the edge of the table in a way that suggested he was grounding himself physically while trying to process something that no longer fit his expectations. Brittany finally spoke again, but this time her voice was quieter, more cautious, asking whether any of this affected immediate distribution or only final settlement. And Daniel responded that certain provisions could influence both timing and eligibility depending on continuation of conduct throughout the reading process. That answer changed something in the room. It was subtle, but I saw it in the way Jason stopped interrupting, in the way Brittany stopped leaning toward him, and in the way the silence between words became more intentional than accidental. I remained still, observing everything without speaking, but my thoughts were no longer focused on what would be distributed. They were focused on how quickly people revealed themselves when they believed their position was being evaluated in real time. Jason's expression tightened again, but this time there was no outburst, only restraint, as if he had realized that reacting too strongly might be part of what was being measured. Daniel Brooks continued reading calmly, explaining that all beneficiaries had been informed of general expectations in prior correspondence and meetings, and that compliance was considered part of the overall intent of the estate plan. I saw Brittany glance briefly toward Jason again, but this time there was hesitation in her eyes, a small but clear distance forming between them, as if she was beginning to separate her own outcome from his. Jason noticed it too, because his hand moved slightly toward her before stopping, as if he had realized that reassurance was no longer automatic. The lawyer's voice remained unchanged, methodical and controlled, but the emotional structure of the room had shifted entirely, from confrontation to uncertainty, from entitlement to evaluation. And in that quiet transformation, I understood something that felt both simple and irreversible, that what was being read aloud was no longer just instructions from the past, but a live reflection of who each of us had become while we were still waiting for something to be given to us. I noticed the atmosphere in the room change again, but this time it was not because of anything new being read aloud. It was because Jason had stopped reacting to the document entirely and had started reacting to the idea that the document was reacting to him, as if every clause was now a silent measurement of who he was in relation to what he believed he deserved. Daniel Brooks continued with the same controlled professionalism, moving into a section that referenced compliance across multiple stages of estate execution and the language became less about distribution and more about verification, as though the entire process was designed to confirm alignment rather than simply assign outcomes. Jason shifted in his seat again, but it was no longer restless movement. It was restrained tension, the kind that builds when a person realizes that speaking less may be safer than speaking more, and I could see him consciously choosing silence for the first time since the reading began. Brittany, however, was no longer mirroring his restraint. She had begun to detach slightly, her gaze no longer fixed on Jason, but moving intermittently between the lawyer and the document itself, as if she was trying to understand whether she was still aligned with the right interpretation of events or if alignment itself had become uncertain. Daniel Brooks adjusted his glasses slightly and continued reading a passage that referenced prior formal acknowledgments made during estate planning sessions, and he clarified that those acknowledgments had been documented with multiple witnesses present, forming part of the permanent legal record. That phrase, permanent legal record, seemed to settle differently in the room, heavier than anything that had been said before, and I saw Jason's expression tighten, not in anger this time, but in recognition that this was not a conversation that could be redirected. For the first time, he did not interrupt. Instead, he stared at the table in front of him as if the surface itself could provide structure where the document no longer did. Brittany leaned back slightly, her hands now folded in her lap, and I could see the subtle shift in her breathing, slower and more deliberate, as if she was consciously distancing herself from emotional alignment and moving toward observation. The lawyer continued without pause, explaining that certain conditions were not only tied to financial outcomes, but also to behavioral consistency throughout the entirety of the proceedings, and that any deviation from expected conduct had been previously noted and would be considered in final determinations. Jason finally looked up again, but his expression had changed. There was no longer confrontation in his eyes, only calculation, as if he was trying to reconstruct the rules of a game that had already been played without his full understanding. I remained still, but my awareness sharpened further, because I began to realize that what my husband had created was not simply a will, it was a system of observation disguised as inheritance, one that had been quietly recording reactions long before any of us realized we were being evaluated. Daniel Brooks turned another page, and the sound of paper felt almost final now, not because anything had ended, but because something irreversible was being revealed. Jason's fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped, and in that small hesitation I saw something I had not seen before in him, uncertainty that was no longer masked by frustration. Brittany finally spoke again, her voice measured and careful, asking a question about timing and whether any adjustments could still be made based on clarification of intent, and Daniel Brooks responded calmly that intent had already been established through documented conduct, and that the reading itself was not a negotiation but a confirmation. That response created a silence that was different from before, not heavy with tension but empty of assumption, as if everyone in the room had suddenly lost access to the version of events they had been relying on. Jason leaned back fully now, no longer attempting to challenge or interpret, simply listening, and I could see the moment where expectation gave way to comprehension, not fully formed yet, but no longer avoidable. Brittany looked down briefly at her hands, then forward again, and in that small movement I understood she was beginning to separate outcome from loyalty, a quiet but significant shift that would change how she positioned herself moving forward. The lawyer continued reading, but the emotional structure of the room had already transformed, because what remained was no longer anticipation of inheritance, but awareness of consequence. And in that awareness, I recognized the final intention behind every carefully chosen word that had brought us to this moment. I could feel the entire room settling into a different kind of silence now, not the tense silence of anticipation, but the heavier silence of realization, the kind that comes when people begin to understand that what they are hearing is not designed to be debated anymore. And Jason seemed to understand it more than anyone else, because he had stopped looking at the lawyer entirely and was now staring at the table as if it had become the only stable surface left in a situation that no longer responded to his expectations. Daniel Brooks continued reading with the same calm precision, moving through the final structured sections that addressed execution procedures and final confirmations, and each sentence felt less like instruction and more like closure slowly unfolding in real time. Brittany sat perfectly still now, her earlier calculated composure replaced by something quieter and more cautious, as if she had begun to understand that proximity to Jason no longer guaranteed proximity to outcome. And I noticed she was no longer reacting to the content itself, but to Jason's lack of reaction, watching him the way people watch shifting ground when they are unsure where it will crack next. Jason finally spoke again, but his voice was no longer raised or confrontational. It was controlled in a way that suggested restraint rather than confidence, asking the lawyer whether all conditions were final or whether there was still room for adjustment based on interpretation or intent. And Daniel Brooks responded without hesitation that everything had already been finalized according to documented directives and witness confirmations. That answer seemed to remove something invisible from the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, like a door quietly locking in place that no one had noticed closing until it was already shut. Jason leaned back slightly, his shoulders lowering for the first time since the reading began, and I could see that the energy he had been holding together through frustration and resistance was now beginning to separate into something more uncertain, something closer to acceptance without understanding. Brittany looked at him briefly, and I saw in that glance something that had not been there earlier, not loyalty or reassurance, but evaluation, as if she was reassessing what alignment with him would now mean under these conditions. The lawyer turned another page and paused only briefly before continuing, his tone unchanged, but the meaning of what he was saying now felt heavier because it no longer added information, it confirmed structure. I remained still, my hands resting calmly in my lap. But inside me there was a growing clarity that what my husband had built was never meant to be interpreted in pieces. It was meant to reveal itself only when all assumptions had already been tested by reaction. Jason's eyes shifted once toward Brittany, but she did not meet his gaze immediately, and in that fraction of delay, I saw something subtle fracture between them, not conflict, but recalibration. Daniel Brooks continued explaining that all beneficiaries had acknowledged prior conditions during earlier formal discussions, and that those acknowledgments were part of the permanent record guiding final execution, and the phrase permanent record seemed to settle differently this time, not as information, but as consequence already in motion. Jason exhaled slowly, looking down again, and this time there was no attempt to interrupt or question, only a quiet stillness that suggested he was now processing what could not be changed. Brittany finally adjusted her posture again, but it was no longer in response to Jason. It was in response to the structure of the situation itself, as if she was beginning to separate herself from expectation and move toward observation. I watched both of them carefully now, not because I expected another outburst, but because I could see the moment approaching where people stop reacting and start understanding, and that moment often reveals more than any words spoken before it. The lawyer's voice remained steady as he concluded the final procedural section, and as the last lines were read, the room did not react with shock or relief or anger, but with something far more revealing, a collective stillness where each person quietly recalculated their position without saying a word. And in that stillness, I understood that what had just unfolded was not a conclusion of events, but a clear unveiling of how every expectation in this room had been quietly measured long before any of us had realized we were being measured at all. I could feel the final stretch of the reading settling over the room like a weight that no one was trying to lift anymore, not because the document had become easier to understand, but because everyone had reached the point where understanding no longer changed the outcome, and Daniel Brooks closed the final section with the same calm precision he had maintained from the beginning, as if nothing in the emotional temperature of the room had altered his responsibility to complete the process exactly as instructed. Jason remained still, no longer leaning forward, no longer resisting, simply sitting in a way that suggested his earlier certainty had dissolved into something quieter and less defined, while Brittany kept her gaze forward but no longer toward him, as if she had already begun to detach her interpretation of events from his. The lawyer placed the final page down and confirmed that all provisions had been fully read and acknowledged according to legal procedure, and in that moment there was no immediate reaction from anyone, only a stillness that felt unusually complete, as if the room itself was waiting to see whether anything would follow. I stayed seated, my hands resting in my lap, and I noticed something I had not expected to feel in a moment like this. Not victory, not relief, but clarity, because everything that had unfolded no longer felt like surprise. It felt like recognition of something that had been in motion long before this day. Jason finally exhaled and looked up, but there was no anger in his expression now, only a tired awareness that whatever structure he had believed he was standing on had been far less stable than he assumed. Brittany shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her posture as if preparing to stand, but she did not move fully, and I could see in her hesitation that she was now considering distance rather than alignment. Daniel Brooks gathered the documents carefully, speaking once more in a neutral tone to confirm procedural completion, and his voice carried no emotion, only finality. I realized then that what mattered most in this room was no longer what had been inherited or distributed, but what had been revealed about how each of us responded when control was no longer available to negotiate. Jason glanced briefly toward me for the first time since the reading had begun, but there was nothing confrontational in it anymore. Only a quiet search for meaning that could no longer be found in the structure of expectation he had brought into the room. Brittany finally stood, smoothing her clothing with a small, controlled motion, and I understood that her decision was no longer about loyalty to a person but alignment with outcome, and that shift was subtle but absolute. The lawyer closed the final folder and confirmed that the session was complete, and the sound of that closure was softer than I expected, yet more definitive than anything spoken before it. No one spoke immediately after that, and in that silence I became aware of how quickly certainty can disappear when it is no longer supported by assumption, how quickly people begin to reconsider their position when there is nothing left to anticipate. Jason remained seated for a few seconds longer, then slowly straightened as if acknowledging that staying in place would no longer change anything, and Brittany stepped slightly away from him without making it obvious, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. I did not move, because I no longer felt the need to, and as I looked at both of them, I understood that what had just ended was not only a legal process but a private illusion each of us had been carrying in different forms. The room began to feel ordinary again, the way rooms do after something irreversible has already happened inside them. And as Daniel Brooks left the table with the documents in hand, I realized that nothing in this moment required explanation anymore, because everything that mattered had already been revealed in the way each of us had chosen to sit, to speak, or to remain silent when the truth finally stopped waiting for permission. During intense family inheritance conflict, the widowed mother faces emotional betrayal from her son and manipulation from the daughter-in-law, as the reading of a will exposes hidden tensions in family stories. This narrative explores how family stories reveal silent fractures within wealth and trust. The widowed mother remains composed while observing how family stories unfold during a legally binding estate reading that challenges loyalty and respect. The son's outburst in front of everyone reveals deeper conflict that has shaped years of family stories built on misunderstanding and control. As the daughter-in-law influences decisions behind the scenes, family stories begin to expose emotional distance and calculated intentions. Every moment in the lawyer's office adds another layer where inheritance becomes secondary to psychological truth and hidden emotional patterns. The widowed mother quietly observes as silence replaces conflict, and the son begins to question everything he believed about control and entitlement itself. Finally, TAGPT. Widowed mother Eleanor Whitmore is a 68-year-old white woman facing camera in a realistic cinematic portrait. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, front view, soft, natural lighting, elegant, serious expression, high detail, realistic, TAGPT. Jason Whitmore is a 45-year-old white American man in a realistic cinematic portrait. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, front view, direct eye contact, formal suit, subtle tension in facial expression, natural lighting, high realism, emotional drama, character focus. 1A high-intensity cinematic scene set inside a modern upscale law office during a dramatic will reading. A long polished mahogany table sits under cold natural light coming through tall glass windows overlooking a distant American city skyline at dusk. Eleanor Whitmore, a 68-year-old white widow, stands firmly on one side of the table, wearing a dark, elegant coat, her face calm, controlled, and emotionally unreadable, as she faces her son Jason Whitmore, a 45-year-old white American man who is leaning forward aggressively across the table, his expression tense, frustrated, and emotionally charged. Between them, legal documents are spread across the table, while lawyer Daniel Brooks stands at the head, holding a sealed folder, creating a formal barrier of authority. The atmosphere is extremely tense, with emotional confrontation and silent power struggle clearly visible in body language. Brittany Hale, a white American woman, stands slightly behind Jason with a subtle, calculating expression, observing both sides carefully, as if influencing the emotional direction of the moment. The lighting is sharp, realistic, cinematic, with deep shadows reflecting emotional conflict. No cartoon. 1, 2. The same law office moments later, but the emotional tension has escalated dramatically, creating a breaking point atmosphere. Jason Whitmore is now partially standing, his chair pushed back behind him, his posture unstable, intense, his face showing frustration and disbelief as he gestures sharply toward the lawyer Daniel Brooks and indirectly toward Eleanor Whitmore, who remains standing but now appears colder, more distant, and fully controlled emotionally. Brittany Hale stands closer to Jason, but her expression has shifted into quiet uncertainty and strategic reassessment as she begins to detach emotionally from his position. The legal documents on the table are slightly disturbed, showing the intensity of the confrontation that has just occurred. The city skyline outside the tall windows is darker now as evening deepens, casting long dramatic shadows across the office, creating a high-contrast cinematic mood. Eleanor's stillness contrasts sharply with Jason's instability, making her presence feel dominant without movement. The atmosphere feels like a turning point where control is shifting and alliances are silently breaking apart. No cartoon. 1, 2, 3. The aftermath of the will reading inside the same modern law office, now filled with heavy silence and emotional aftermath. Jason Whitmore is seated again, but his posture is lowered and exhausted, his earlier aggression replaced with uncertainty and emotional collapse as he stares downward, avoiding eye contact. Eleanor Whitmore stands near the table, composed and calm, her expression controlled and unreadable, suggesting full acceptance of what has been revealed. Brittany Hale now stands further away from Jason physically and emotionally, her body language showing clear detachment and reassessment of her position within the situation. Lawyer Daniel Brooks calmly closes the final legal folder, signaling the end of the formal process. The lighting is dimmer and softer as daylight fades outside the city windows, creating a somber, cinematic atmosphere with deep shadows and quiet finality. The room feels emotionally emptied after conflict, with all characters now repositioned mentally and emotionally after irreversible revelations. No cartoon. 1, 2.